address this question whether autonomy is the right ideal for a well-lived life. I'm taking it that I'm talking to some to philosophers here and some to non-philosophers. So that's the level at which I'm going to talk about this issue. And the answer that I'm going to give is a qualified no. I think with qualifications, autonomy, at least considered in a certain respect, is not a good ideal for a well-lived life. And there are two reasons that I'm going to answer in the negative, at least two that I can understand. In the first place, the ideal of autonomy, it seems to me, is a peculiarly modern ideal that covers up a whole variety of worthwhile possibilities at which we might be aiming in living a life, and at which people in earlier epochs in the history of the West understood themselves to be aiming in living a well-lived life. And I think that in a certain way, we can think about these earlier epochs as not as epochs that were on the way to our modern and final understanding of what human beings are about, but rather as alternative characterizations that are actually clearer about some aspects of human existence than we are now as a result of the importance of this ideal. So when taken as a solitary ideal, against the background of which we not only make every decision in our life, but conceive the possibility of every goal, aim, appropriate desire, or achievement, considered that way, autonomy narrows the scope and deadens the quality of well-lived lives. In addition to being incomplete in this way, that's the first reason I'm going to resist the idea that it should be the principle on the basis of which we live our lives, or aim to live our lives. In addition to being incomplete in this way, the ideal of autonomy is also unlivable. I've written about this in other places, and I won't talk too much about it, but I'll say something about it here. When taken in its most extreme form, as it is, for instance, in certain strains, at any rate, of Nietzsche's work, or in certain aspects of Sartre's existentialism, the demand for an unmitigated autonomy can lead to an inability to recognize the ground for any distinctions of worth in a life. That state, the state of being unable to recognize the ground for any distinctions of worth in a life, is a state that one might rightly call nihilism, because of its insistence that nothing, what's revealed in this state is that nothing stands above anything else in a hierarchy of meanings or worthwhile ways of life. And I take it, unlike Nietzsche in some of his moments, that nihilistic life really is a life that's difficult to live, or maybe even unlivable. Because the ideal of autonomy is both incomplete, therefore, and taken as a solitary and unitary ideal, unlivable, we have to resist the idea that autonomy should be the sole and unitary standard in conceiving, in virtue of what, a life is well lived. But my answer to the title question, is autonomy the right ideal, will be qualified as well. So that's the reason I'll be against it. Autonomy covers up other good options that we could be aiming at. And also, if you took it as the only ideal, it would lead to an unlivable life. But my answer to the question about autonomy will be qualified as well. For autonomy is not in every case to be resisted. There are forms of autonomy that are worth embracing, temporarily, at least in certain circumstances. And I don't intend to say very much about what these forms are in this talk. Although I'll just point out as a sort of side note, if I had to say something, and maybe people will want to ask about this later, if I had to say something, I would talk about a certain kind of freedom that we do have, I think, and that it's important to take seriously, which is the freedom to cultivate in ourselves skills, either social skills or other kinds of skills in various domains, that give us an openness to meanings that are already out there in the world. And this idea of education or cultivation as the development of a skill is, I think, development of a skill, like the skill of playing the piano or the skill of being a good soccer player or some other kind of the skill of being a woodworker. That development of a skill in a domain is the paradigm of this kind of cultivation. Once you've got the skill, you can recognize distinctions of worth in the domain that people who don't have the skill can't recognize. The grandmaster chess player can recognize immediately that an option, that there's a danger here when someone, and that's really a distinction of worth, a danger to the bishop on the king's side. The grandmaster chess player can recognize this distinction of worth in virtue of the skill he's got for playing chess, and someone without that skill can't recognize that danger, or can't recognize it in the way that the grandmaster does. So development of a skill is a paradigm for the kind of the freedom that we have to cultivate in ourselves the ability to be open to and recognize distinctions of worth in a domain. And more generally, I think, that this freedom to cultivate in ourselves skills for recognizing distinctions of worth, that idea is a sort of key to the Greek notion of education as paideia, where what you're developing in yourself, or cultivating in yourself, is the skill to recognize how one goes on in various kinds of social circumstances. And I don't think it's only a Greek idea. It's an idea that you find, for instance, in Dante also. I'm going to talk about Dante some later, but in the middle chapters of the Purgatorio, what Dante thinks is happening is that people who are going through this sort of cleansing process in purgatory, cleansing themselves of the various sins and vices that they've got, what they're doing is cultivating in themselves the ability to recognize good things as good things and bad things as bad things through various kinds of spiritual exercises. And Dante may have been Greek in the sense that he owed a lot to Aquinas' Aristotle, but he does this story in a Christian form. So it's not just a Greek story. So if I were going to say something about the forms of autonomy that I thought were important, I would say something about that, the freedom we have to cultivate in ourselves, skills by means of which we can recognize distinctions of worth that are already out there in the socio-cultural environment. But I'm not going to say anything about that. So we want to ask this question: is autonomy the right ideal for a well-lived life? And to ask the question properly, of course, the first thing you've got to know something about is what autonomy is, or what we take it to be when we're asking the question. So what exactly is autonomy in the way that I understand it? And why might one think that it's a reasonable ideal against which to measure the success of human existence? I'm going to go through a variety of different versions of the notion of autonomy, and I think there's something seductive and appealing about many of them, before I go through and try to say what I think is wrong with them. So of course the locus classicus for the position is found in Kant, and the details are worked out in the practical philosophy generally. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm just going to say a very short bit about what Kant says in the context of his popular essay from 1784, the What is Enlightenment essay. I think this gives us a simple and intuitive characterization of the position. In the essay, you probably remember, Kant argues that the age of enlightenment is characterized by a kind of maturity that human beings have then reached over the course of the development of throughout history. A maturity that they reach when they come to recognize themselves as beings who legislate for themselves the rightness or morality of their actions. You remember the very opening of the essay, the first two sentences, Kant writes, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity." Kant cares a lot about the fact that this immaturity has been, over the course of history, self-imposed. But immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. We're now released from that kind of immaturity as a result of understanding things about ourselves that we didn't earlier understand. So the mature and autonomous human being, according to Kant, recognizes, or at any rate ought to recognize, himself or herself as the source of the authority behind the moral laws to which he or she feels bound. In choosing to perform one action over any other action, therefore, the agent cannot pass off the justification for his choice onto any authority other than himself. No God, no set of legal constraints, no father figure or biblical passage, no social norm or custom or tradition or historical practice. None of these things is the proper ground for the authority of the moral law to which we feel ourselves bound. We, on Kant's view, are the ultimate source of the authority of our moral principles. In this sense, we are autonomous. Literally, we legislate ourselves. We give ourselves the moral law. So that's the classic case of the principle that says what it is to be our kind of being is to understand ourselves as autonomous in the sense that the moral principles and the moral law by means of which we feel ourselves bound, or to which we feel ourselves bound, has for its authority us as the source. Earlier versions of this idea can be found in the tradition leading up to Kant, of course. And I'm not going to, all of these have their differences and their peculiarities. I'm just going to say a word or two about them. For instance, Descartes, on whose conception of the self I think Kant depends essentially, develops a conception of the self according to that insists that we are beings essentially defined by the authority that we have over knowledge about ourselves. So there's an idea, kind of metaphysical conception in Descartes, that what characterizes us as the kind of beings that we are is a kind of authority that we have over ourselves. It's not the same kind of authority that Kant is interested in, but nevertheless it's a kind of authority. The realm of the mental, which characterizes us, on Descartes' view, we are the res cogitans, the thinking thing. The realm of the mental is the realm by means of which we are defined, according to Descartes. And the knowledge we have of our own mental states is a knowledge the authority for which resides entirely within ourselves. That's a different notion of autonomy. It doesn't say that we're the source of the moral law to which we feel ourselves bound, but it does say we're essentially characterized by a kind of first-person authority that we have over the mental states that we find ourselves in. So there's a kind of autonomy at the essence of Descartes' characterization of the kind of being that we are. There's a much earlier version of the autonomy view that's different still, that you could find all the way back in the Stoics. So for instance, Marcus Aurelius insists that a basic principle of existence lies in the recognition that no external thing can cause us pain, or anything else, unless we acquiesce in the judgment that it is painful, or whatever else we feel it to be. So according to Marcus, the life to aim at is the life of self-control, control over the judgments that you allow yourself, a life in which we continuously hold sway or have authority over, exercise our authority over, our response to external provocation by recognizing that it is within our authority to accept or deny that something should affect us. A quick passage from the Meditations. Marcus writes, pain is either an evil to the body, in which case let the body say what it thinks of it. But of course the body doesn't say anything, so that's a sort of irrelevant option. Or it's an evil to the soul, which is the option he thinks is right. But it's in the power of the soul to maintain its own serenity and tranquility, and not to think that pain is an evil. For every judgment and movement and desire and diversion is within, and insofar as it's within, we maintain a certain kind of authority over it, and no evil ascends so high. Okay, so those are three different versions of the idea that we're the being that's properly characterized as a kind of being that's got authority over ourselves in a certain way, and in that sense are autonomous. I think it's interesting to point out that there's a version of this Stoic account that's running around nowadays, at least in American culture, and that you find in the writings of a novelist named David Foster Wallace. Wallace committed suicide 3 years ago now, but 3 years before that, he gave what's now become a very well-known graduation speech to the graduating seniors at Kenyon College, a small liberal arts college in Ohio. And it was published, this small little graduation speech was published as a book. As Harry Frankfurt said, they could do amazing things with font size and so on. And in this graduation speech, Wallace insists that the most important lesson of a liberal arts education is that it allows one to recognize that it's up to oneself to determine what one chooses to think about the meaning of any event or situation. The recognition of this authority allows one to deal in a sanguine way with events that otherwise might overpower you. I see this as a kind of Aurelian Stoicism. Wallace writes, and I'm going to read this because he's a great writer. So he's going along talking about what it's going to be like for these graduates after they leave school. He says, you haven't really come to understand the extreme nature of the boredom and the anger and the awfulness that characterizes our existence, the existence of a grown-up human being. And you're going to have to deal with that. And here's what you can do. He says, most days, if you're aware enough to give yourself a choice, you can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-made-up lady who just screamed at her kid in the checkout line, making you angry at her, according to him. Maybe she's not usually like this, you can say to yourself. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights holding the hand of a husband who's dying of bone cancer. Or maybe this very lady is the low-wage clerk at the motor vehicle department who just yesterday helped your spouse resolve a horrific, infuriating red tape problem through some small act of bureaucratic kindness. Of course, none of this is likely, but it's also not impossible. It just depends what you want to consider. If you're automatically sure that you know what reality is, and you're operating on your default setting, then you, like me, probably won't consider possibilities that aren't annoying and miserable. But if you really learn how to pay attention, which the liberal arts education is supposed to allow you to do, teach you to do, then you will know there are other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell-type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that made the stars, love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down. That's what your liberal arts education will teach you. Now, Wallace's point, it's interesting. I think it's not primarily a metaphysical point. His point is not that the world really is this lovely. That metaphysical question, I think, according to Wallace, is neither here nor there. On Wallace's view, what matters is not whether the world is actually filled with mystical oneness, but only that we are the kinds of beings that can choose to think this about the world if we so desire. I understand this to be a kind of Nietzschean position. Of course, Nietzsche held a lot of views, so it's not the only Nietzschean position, but a kind of Nietzschean position according to which we are free from all historical or other constraint, free to invent or create the meaningful world in which we live. And Wallace, I think, is proposing that once you recognize that, you can learn to deal with situations that are awful. And that is a kind of full-on autonomy. You have the ability, maybe even the responsibility, to understand a situation in a way that will allow you to get a kind of joy out of it. Of course, Wallace did commit suicide, and I think, and I actually, I mean, you know, you want to be careful about this. but I ultimately what I think is that there's something fundamentally unlivable about the position that he's recommending here. because it seems to me that this is a kind of logical extension of the lesson of autonomy. It's a kind of position, as I say, that Nietzsche maybe thought to hold in certain parts of the gay science, say, or maybe later in the Will to Power. It's maybe a kind of Sartrean position. It's a position according to which we have complete and total freedom to generate, without constraint and ex nihilo, the meaning of any situation or event. And considered that way, I think it's an unlivable position. And the reason for this has to do with an interesting fact, I think it's an interesting fact, about the psychological structure of human beings. We can't come to believe something simply by deciding that we would like to believe that thing. I think belief, there's a lot of literature about the normativity of belief in the analytic philosophical domain. And I'm not going to go into that. I just want to make the simple point. I think in a certain way, believing is a little bit like being in love. You can't decide to love someone and then, having made the decision, bring the state into existence. And so too, I think you can't decide to believe something, and by deciding that you're going to believe it, bring into existence the state of your believing it. I think it's more complicated than that. I think you have to do a kind of a workaround. And there are versions of the workaround. In culture, I was in China in December. In cultures that still, to some extent, believe in arranged marriages, they think the workaround happens this way. They say, of course it's true that the man and woman don't love one another when they get married. Why would you want that? That's not the way. That's not a good basis for a marriage. This kind of temporary romantic love that's going to go away. But what happens is, by occupying the relative roles with respect to one another, and by taking up those positions in the way that one can aspire to do, given the norms of the society, then over years they will come to interact with one another in such a way that will bring about in them the kind of appropriate love that a husband and a wife should have for one another. So there's a kind of a workaround, but that's a long-term workaround. It's a bit like the workaround that Pascal suggests. Remember, everyone reads the wager, but I find that the thing about one of the things in the Meditations that's most interesting, not the wager, but the part after the wager. He says, okay, I've given you this reason to believe in God. Let's suppose we believe the argument that Pascal gives in the wager. And then Pascal says, but if you're unlucky, you still don't believe in God, right? You know that it's better to. Imagine being in this position. You know that it's better to believe in God than not to believe in God. But now you're confronted with the question, how do I come to have that belief? And Pascal's very strong intuition is, you can't come to have that belief just by deciding that you ought to have that belief. There's a big difference between knowing that you ought to believe something and actually believing it. So Pascal says that you ought to engage in the practice of a kind of arranged marriage. Namely, you ought to do the things that people who stand in the relationship with the church and the relationship with God that you'd like to stand in, or know you ought to stand in, having been convinced by this argument. Do the things that those people do. And by occupying that role long enough, if you're lucky, it will come about in you that you have the relevant kinds of beliefs. I think that's a similar that's the arranged marriage workaround. And I'm not sure that it works. I think Pascal's not sure that it works. I think for Pascal, it really matters that you can do this, and that'll give you the option of being graced with belief. But ultimately, it's not up to you. And that sounds probably right to me. In the arranged marriage, it's no guarantee that even if you hold up these roles the way that society tells you to, you'll come to have the kind of relationship with the spouse that you were aiming at. But at least it's a potential workaround. I think William James thinks something about this in the stuff about the will to believe. Okay, at any rate, the main point here is that I want to draw the distinction between feeling or knowing that you ought to believe something and actually believing it. And I think that's a distinction that Wallace doesn't seem to sort of recognize. He thinks that the kind of being we are is so fully autonomous that if we decide that it's better to believe something rather than something else, then the mere fact of deciding it is enough to put us in the state of believing it. And since I think that's not a very good characterization of our capacities, that's one of the reasons I think that full-on autonomy of the sort that Wallace recommends, and maybe that Sartre recommends, and maybe that Nietzsche recommends, is unlivable. Now, it's worth pointing out that despite this long and storied history of the ideal of autonomy, there's an equally vaunted history in the West that sees the application of this kind of freedom as characteristic of the worst in human beings, instead of characterizing an appropriate standard at which to aim. This is a separate issue. This is not the issue that if you held that standard, you'd be put in an unlivable position. This is the position that says, I'm going to go through history and find some people who think that actually that standard, the standard of autonomy, it's if you were aiming at that, far from being the most responsible, best kind of individual we can be, you'd be the worst. So I think there's actually a lot of places in history to look for this alternative position. But I'm just going to say briefly something about one, and then I'm going to focus on a second. So I'm going to start with the High Middle Ages. Maybe it's not surprising that before Kant, we didn't have clearly, or before Descartes, we didn't have clearly before ourselves this ideal of autonomy. Although, as I pointed out, Marcus Aurelius and Stoic seem to have some version of it. But let's look at Dante. Dante, who's writing around 1300, really does believe, instead of pretending to believe, as Wallace does, that God's love embodies a mystical oneness, and that it's an ultimate and fundamental force of the universe that, he says at the end of the Paideia, moves the sun and the other stars. And he's got a metaphysical account of the kind of being that we are that fits naturally into this conception of the universe. We human beings, on Dante's account, are so constructed by God that so long as we don't get in the way by autonomously choosing to do one thing or another, we'll shoot like an arrow, this is his metaphor, shoot like an arrow directly out of the bowstring and go straight towards God's love, living a life of love and oneness in his light. So that's a metaphysical conception of the universe, a conception according to which human beings, far from being characterized ultimately by the authority we have over ourselves and our existence, are instead created with a need that can only be filled with love for God, and perhaps also through that love for God, love for one another. I think it's an interesting thing in Dante's actual position that the state we're aiming at seems to be a state of blissfully contemplating God, but not actually doing anything down here on earth. I think that's a weird position to be in. It sort of says that the best possible life is the life of the mystic who goes out in the wilderness and doesn't see anyone and just lives in this state of bliss that you get into when you're contemplating God. I don't think that Christianity as a whole requires that. I think the early Christians had a different view, and I think Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov has a different view, but I won't talk about that. So, but on this view, the ultimate power in the universe is God's love, and it's a love that pulls everything, including us, towards it. God is the generative force of the universe that has the power of the bowstring, quote unquote, according to Dante. And then this from the first canto of the Paideia, this power that directs whatever it fires toward a joyful target, namely God, and carries us towards that target now as if to the appointed place. So Dante's view is that if you're brought up in the right kind of society and in the church and you're cultivated appropriately and you don't do anything to get in your own way, then you'll just live the right kind of life. He says it is true, of course, that you could do something to get in your own way. He says it's true that as form is sometimes inadequate to the artist's intention because the material fails to answer, so the creature that has power so impelled to swerve towards some other place than God sometimes deserts the track if its first impulse is deflected towards earth by false pleasures. So we can go awry, but when we go awry, it's by the exercise of our freedom. And so what can happen, and this is this sort of the moral psychological structure of the Divine Comedy. What you find in the Inferno, for instance, are a variety of ways in which, by directing our love towards something other than God, you can come to live a life that's characterized by some vice or another. So that's a perversion, a turning away from God, and towards, for instance, the love of food in the glutton, or the love of money in the greedy or the avarice, and so on. And you can make an even worse mistake, according to Dante, if instead of just turning your love away from God and directing it at some other entity, you avert instead of pervert your love. You don't turn your love anywhere other than towards yourself. You can come to love yourself so much that you think the right principle for action is the principle of taking responsibility for your action rather than having it drawn out of you by the love that you feel for God. When you reject altogether the love of God, choosing instead to act out of love for ourselves and our own ability to choose freely whatever we like, then we avert our love and act instead on the principle of autonomous choice. And the paradigm of this kind of autonomous being, on Dante's view, is the paradigmatic rebellious angel, Satan. As Milton said of Satan, it's a different kind of Satan in Milton, but as Milton said of him, he would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. He would rather have the responsibility for making his own choices someplace awful than have to live in the light of the love of God. But on Dante's view, this kind of autonomous activity is ultimately inert, lacking all connection as it does with the ultimate generative power of the universe, namely God's love. And as a result, the Satan in Dante's Inferno, defined entirely by his own autonomy, lives at the icy cold center of hell. Hell in Dante is cold instead of hot. And it's cold because it's as far as possible in the universe from the pure motive power of God's love. And when you live there, you, like Satan, are barely capable even of flapping your wings. You're not capable. If all you depend on for making choices is your own autonomy, on Dante's view, it turns out you're not capable of doing anything. Now, the idea that as human beings we're less good when we freely and autonomously make our own decisions about our beliefs and actions, that to lay the responsibility for our choices squarely upon our own shoulders is to diminish us as the kind of beings we are, rather than to exalt us, that idea, I think, is common in a variety of other epochs in the history of the West as well, although I think it takes radically different forms in each of these other epochs. Each of these epochs emphasize a different understanding of what, other than autonomy, we should be aiming at. And I'm not going to explore all of these, nor even any of them in very much detail. But I do want to describe briefly a sort of deeply non-Christian epic, which is the Homeric epic, because I think it has clearly in its sights a conception of some aspect of the life well lived that we could be aiming at, that it's hard for us to see because we're so overwhelmed by the idea that autonomy is the relevant principle. So I'm just going to say a little bit about Homer, and then I'll end. So there's a standard conception of Homer and of what we're doing when we're reading Homer that's due to that was made popular. Do classicists make things popular? I mean, it was popular in the intellectual world at any rate in the mid-20th century. Bruno Snell is maybe the best representative of this position vis-a-vis Homer. And Snell thought that at least one of the reasons to read Homer maybe the main reason to read Homer, is because you recognize that Homer stands at the beginning of a tradition of history in the West that finds its final and ultimate sort of formulation in the modern world. So Homer begins that tradition, and the interesting thing to do, a tradition that ends, by the way, with a characteristic paradigm of autonomy and responsibility as the center of us as human agents. Homer begins that tradition, but gets it wrong in lots of interesting ways. His conception of the self is undeveloped in lots of interesting ways, and so you want to go through and see what the ways are in which he failed to understand what we now understand about ourselves. This way of relating to Homer, I think, is now considered to be rather old-fashioned. Bernard Williams did an important job in overturning it when he gave the Sather lectures at Berkeley that were published as Shame and Necessity, showing that Homer's Greeks and the classical Greeks generally are much more complicated and interesting than you might have thought. But I want to focus on something that Bernard doesn't talk about at all. I want to focus on something that I think Homer's got a lot clearer. It's not just that he's got a poor approximation of the good view that we've got. It's that his view is a lot clearer about some good options that we've now covered up as a result of being motivated so much by the principle of autonomy. Homer has a particular vocabulary that I'm going to adopt in describing this position. But unlike with Dante, I don't think this vocabulary actually has any metaphysical commitments to it. But Homer and Dante do agree about one thing. They agree about this for very different reasons, though. They agree that human beings are at their best precisely in those moments in which they're not acting fully autonomously and taking responsibility for their actions. Now, Homer's way of saying this is to say that at their best, human beings are looked over by the gods. And this is a very, for us, I think, a very strange position. And I want to give a reading of this position that highlights what I think is phenomenologically accurate in it, but that doesn't need any metaphysical commitment to the existence of the gods, as Homer may well have understood them. So Homer says, he articulates this position when he says in a variety of places, but especially in the third book of the Odyssey, all men need the gods. You can't live a good life in the absence of the gods, according to Homer. So the question is, what does that mean? Why would you say something like that? Well, here's one thing that I think it means. I think it's a commitment to the idea that the worst kind of human being is the one who, by means of a certain kind of hubris, sees in himself the source of the good things that happen to him. So when you find characters who exhibit this kind of hubris, you'll often see Homer criticizing them or explaining the bad things that happen to them in virtue of their having that relation to themselves. So here's an example of the latter position. In Book 4 of the Odyssey, one of the characters tells a story about the lesser Ajax. There were two Ajaxes, a big, huge Telamonian Ajax who had a shield that went all the way up to his head, and the lesser Ajax, who was just littler, I think. He was fast. He was fast, too, yeah, that's right, because he was littler. So they want to find out what happened to the lesser Ajax. Telemachus wants to find out, or someone wants to find out, I can't remember who, what happened to the lesser Ajax after the Trojan War. And there's a discussion of his trip back home. And it turns out that he died on the way back home. And what I'm interested in is Homer's description of the nature of his death. So what happens, apparently, is that Ajax is in a ship, and the ship gets wrecked. And he's the only one who survives. And he climbs up onto some kind of rock where he stands, sort of having survived this thing. And he gets extremely happy. really pleased with himself. So pleased with himself that he starts shouting about how great he is that he managed to survive this awful shipwreck and nobody else could. And then what happens, presumably, I think, is that there's a kind of earthquake and the rock splits and the lesser Ajax falls in and dies. But of course that's not exactly the way Homer describes it. Homer says what happens is that when the lesser Ajax was shouting about how great he is for being the source of his own salvation, Zeus, who knows that the lesser Ajax didn't have anything to do with his own salvation, gets angry at him and throws a thunderbolt and the rock splits and the lesser Ajax falls into the water and dies. Now, I'm not invested at all in the idea that the second explanation of the metaphysics of the event is the right explanation. But what I am interested in is the idea that from Homer's point of view, that might count. That's to say, the hubris that the lesser Ajax exhibits in this context might count as a reasonable explanation for why he ended up dying in this situation. And I take it that it counts as a reasonable explanation for Homer because he thinks this is the exhibition of the worst kind of characteristic that one could have. The characteristic of taking responsibility for your actions when something good comes out of them. That's an awful thing to do. But of course, that is a version of what we aim at, according to the principle of autonomy. We aim to be able to take responsibility and autonomously choose our actions so that they come out well, and so that we can say, when they come out well, that we were responsible for them having done so. But Homer sees this, I think, as the worst possibility for a human life. And I think you see this in other contexts. You see this, for instance, in the context of the suitors, the famous bad guys in the Odyssey, who have taken over Odysseus' royal palace and royal estate and are eating through his vast stores of wine and food in the hopes that Penelope will give up on Odysseus coming home and she will marry one of them. And the suitors are sort of characteristic bad guys. They all get killed in the end, many in gruesome ways. And we're supposed to cheer for that on Homer's view because they manifest a way of life that one can't endorse. And I think one of the interesting things about the suitors is that, I don't know if anyone's ever written about this. As far as I can tell, they are never presented as making sacrifices to the gods. The suitors' relation to the gods is a relation of total externality, as far as I can see. There are certain circumstances where, for instrumental reasons, they seem to perform sacrifices. But my reading of those is that they're not doing it in the right way or in the right mindset. They're not doing it in recognition of the fact that they depend upon the gods for something. Okay, so there are a bunch of people who in distancing themselves from the gods, fail to adhere to the principle that Homer articulates, that all men need the gods, and that living in the light of the gods is what we ought to be aiming at. So why should we be aiming at this on Homer's view? What conception of what's good in a human life does Homer have that requires that in order to do well in your life, you've got to recognize your dependence upon the gods? I think that Homer is obsessed with a whole range of aspects of existence that we tend to cover up, which have the following feature. They are aspects of existence that are such that you can't do well in them by taking responsibility for them. And he describes these situations as situations in which what's required is a recognition of a non-self-identical authority that you can get yourself in the right relation to that can draw an activity out of you. Let me give you a range of examples. These are examples that I draw from Homer, and they're all of different sorts, but they all have that feature in common. Here's the first one, Book 5 of the Odyssey. Odysseus has been lost at sea for 2 weeks, I think. and he's holding on to a timber that's left over from the ship, and he's been floating around. He's exhausted, he's hungry, he's starved. Maybe it's 2 days. Long time, anyhow, to be at sea. And he comes up near a shore line. It's the first time he's seen the shore. And the shore is it's very dangerous because the shore is ringed round with rocks. So he's trying to understand what he should do in this situation. And he seems to have 2 options. One is to aim for the shore and risk being dashed upon the rocks. And the other is to aim to stay away from the shore and risk starving or dying from thirst. And neither of those seems a very good option. And Homer describes Odysseus as sort of going back and forth in his mind and unable to make a decision. He can't find a ground for making this difficult choice. And then what happens is that the wave takes hold of him, throws him toward the rock, and amazingly, without even knowing he's done it, he reaches out and grabs the rock and saves himself. Except that that's not the way Homer describes it. What Homer says is that the wave came in, took Odysseus rushing towards the rock. And at that moment, Athena put an idea in his mind that he should reach out and grab the rock like this. Now, why would you describe it that way? Why would you describe the situation as a situation in which Athena put this idea in his mind that he should reach out and grab the rock that way? Well, I take it there's something, in a way, recognizable about that description. It does sometimes happen that people who are very skilled in a certain domain, and Odysseus is very skilled in the domain of survival, let's call it generally, people who are very skilled in a certain domain do something in the domain that's recognizable to those watching them as extraordinary, as something that you wouldn't have imagined they'd have been able to do. You can see it when a great musician plays a passage extraordinarily well, or a whole piece extraordinarily well, or when a great athlete does something extraordinary on the ball field. And a natural way to describe what it's like to be in those situations, and people who are in them will often describe it this way, is to say that it didn't feel like I was the source of the activity. It felt instead as though the activity was drawn out of me. Sometimes they'll say, I just did what was demanded of me in this situation. And I think that experience of the situations putting a demand on you to which you acquiesce is an experience that people who are very skilled in a domain, who have cultivated in themselves the capacity to operate very well in a certain domain, can at their best aspire to. And in those situations, it's true, I think, that if, rather than experiencing the activity as drawn out of you, you deliberate and try to figure out which activity to perform, you'll always do it less well than you would have done it otherwise. And so I take it that's a reinterpretation of what Homer's on to when he says in this context that Odysseus was able to do this thing not by means of himself, but because Athena put the idea in his mind. Odysseus was able to do this in such a way that he experienced the activity as drawn out of him by a demand of the situation, rather than as deliberated upon and decided upon and generated from him. There are a lot of other examples of situations in which Homer describes a god appearing to a hero, and as a result, the hero's doing something extraordinary. But sometimes the extraordinary things are really minor. I think all of these are really interesting kinds of examples. So here's a different kind of example altogether. In Book 6 of the Odyssey, am I at time? Oh yeah, okay. What time do I end at? 1:30. Or whatever, 30 it is. Okay, yeah. So here's another example. Odysseus at a certain point just after he's landed on the shore, he's been at sea for 2 days, he's got seaweed hanging out of his beard, and his skin is all wrinkly, and he's muddy, and he's awful, and he's exhausted. But he comes upon these beautiful princesses, and it's very important that he get them to help him, take him to the palace where he can recover. but he thinks about it for a moment, and he recognizes that it's not going to work all that well if he comes up to them in the state that he's in. So he goes away for a bit and cleans up. And then he comes back. And when he's described in this amazing way when he comes back, Homer says that his hair is now shining and curly with this kind of glow to it as a result of him having washed it in the sea, presumably, or something. And he's straighter and taller and more beautiful than he could otherwise have been. And he has all these features as a result of Athena having graced him with a certain kind of presence. But I think it's really just a kind of presence that he's got. I think that he manages to get himself in a situation of being incredibly confident and incredibly able to stand tall and feel good about himself in that situation. And as a result, he gives off this kind of presence that other people experience as the presence of nobility or beauty or extraordinary ability. And I think it's true that people can do that. And I think it's also true that the last way to do that is by deciding that you'd like your hair to look a certain way, or that you'd like to stand up a certain way, or something like that. People who really manifest that kind of presence, I think, in a certain way, feel it drawn out of them. They feel the world as giving them the right clues to recognize that this is in them, rather than deciding that they're going to present themselves this way. That's a very different kind of example than the example of reaching out to the rock. There are lots of other examples. At a certain point, Odysseus and Telemachus work incredibly well together when they're gathering weapons. And they're working so well together that Telemachus says to Odysseus, "It seems as though there's this light in the room. It's just everything is clear what we need to be doing." And Odysseus says to him, the wise father figure says to him, "Don't look at that light," he says. "That's the presence of the gods. But if you look at it, it's going to go away." And I think what that means is that sometimes it does happen that people in a kind of social circumstance work seamlessly together. And the moment you focus on the fact that you're working seamlessly together, everything will stop working seamlessly. If you experience the situation as demanding certain things of each of you, given the role that you play vis-a-vis the situation, then you'll continue to work seamlessly together. And Homer describes that as you're all having been directed by the gods. I'll just give one last example. I'm fascinated by the fact that Homer is fascinated by the fact that his heroes go to sleep and wake up. I've never read a story where so many times the author will mention or say that so-and-so went to sleep, so-and-so woke up. But it's not just that he says that so-and-so went to sleep or so-and-so woke up. Every time a character goes to sleep or wakes up, Homer seems to describe it in a different way. Sweet sleep was cast upon his eyes, or he was dragged down into sleep, or he was abruptly woken. He's got tons and tons of metaphors for this. And it turns out that every time it happens because a god or a goddess is involved. And if you think about it, that seems right. I mean, our authors don't write about, they write about dreams, what happens when you're asleep. But nobody writes about what it's like to be going to sleep, or what it's like to be waking up. I'm sure someone will give me a counterexample, but it seems to me that's not much of a consideration nowadays. But I think it's at the center of Homer's characterization of the kind of being that we are, because going to sleep and waking up are precisely not the kinds of things that one can do by deciding and trying harder to do them. Now, that's guaranteed to be the way not to go to sleep. Waking, I don't know how anyone wakes up. That's a different issue. But let's just going to sleep. Going to sleep is precisely the kind of thing that requires you to get into a relation to the situation. That's the relation of allowing it to put you through a progression of stages that you couldn't go through if you were trying to go through that. And I think it's because of that characteristic, because of Homer's conception of human existence as at its best when we're doing the things that we can't do on our own, that Homer's able to focus on this kind of case and say that that's where the gods, that's where another place where the gods appear, or might fail to appear. That seems to be a radically different conception of what we might be aiming at in living the best life possible, aiming to do these things that we've got the skill for doing so well that we experience ourselves not as the source of the actions we're involved in, but as having the actions demanded of us by the situation in which we find ourselves. That's a radically different conception of human excellence that I'm interested in. I think if you went through the history of the West, you'd see a whole range of different conceptions that take autonomy as the opposite of what we're aiming at, but opposite in a variety of different ways. Okay, thanks.